I'm going to preface this by saying thank you, everybody, and thanks to the JMM for having me back again. It's great. I want to preface this by saying I'm going to kind of stream through a lot of this, especially in the beginning, kind of quickly, because a lot of it, frankly, is in the exhibition, but a lot of this is sort of setting the stage. The other thing that I'll add is that I came to this project and I come to the topic of scrap with, unlike many people, as I learned throughout this process, with no background in it whatsoever. And so over the last 4+ years, almost 5 years, it's really been an incredible eye-opener for me as a historian to see just how much of the world, the built environment, and material culture is made out of material that has been used, reused, and reused. Okay, so let's start. Scrapyard. What I like best about this story is about kind of the best topics for me as a historian. Technology, immigration, Americanization, identity, and entrepreneurship. It is much bigger than just take an object and find something to do with it after it's run its use. And nothing really sums it up better than, I think, this video. Let's see if we can.
Hey, mister, you buy our clothes? You buy our clothes?
Yes.
Just a minute.
Okay. I'm going to turn the volume down for the sake of timing. So what we see here is an old newsreel from the 1930s on the Lower East Side. It's a little bit contrived, but that's not important. You have this gentleman here speaking in a Yiddish accent. You were probably hearing all of the English that he knows at this point. Walking around the Lower East Side yelling, old clothes, trying to find somebody who would like to sell them their old clothes. This woman, who has a nondescript accent, I think she's supposed to be an Italian immigrant, is selling him her husband's suit. They barter for a little bit, and he walks on. So what's going on here? This is a person who came to the United States, came off the boat, and had very few, if any, skills that were conventionally marketable. But the one thing that he could do is walk around buying and selling material. And that's what he did, in this case, as part of the rag trade. That's emblematic of this good stuff that I'm talking about. Let's figure out our terms, first of all. What is scrap? Scrap is discarded materials. It's the things that we no longer use that can be used again. Scrap, essentially, in today's terms, equals recycling. When and where did it come from? It's as old as humanity itself. You cannot have a functioning society without resources, and before the industrial age, you recycled as much as possible, and now we recycle less, but thankfully we're getting wise to that. And it's a byproduct of human consumption. If I eat food and I have leftovers, the leftover material, the corn husks, can be used for something. They can be used for fertilizer, but they can also be used to weave into carpeting. But there's also a Jewish connection to scrap. Prescriptions on how to handle scrap materials appear in the Mishnah. Mishnah Kelim, for anybody who's already familiar with this, it goes into really how you handle materials that brass or bronze materials that you may or may not need to use in a religious context after they have given up their use. And one example is, in fact, this ladle holder from Burnt House in Jerusalem. It's one of the archaeological sites near the Western Wall. This is a piece of bronze, that's metallurgy conforms to Mishnaic principles for how you actually recycle pure and impure metals. So there is very much a Jewish religious basis for scrap. Didn't make it into the show, unfortunately, because of space, but I just love that story. We get a little bit later to Edo, Japan, in the 17th through the 19th century, and what we have in this wonderful object from the Los Angeles County Museum of Art is an 1854 image of a scrap dealer in Japan buying broken bits of swords and shields and other armor from samurai who are in need of money. My son, who's really into ninjas right now, loves this picture. So we get to the present. And in colonial America, scrap was critical. This is a reproduction on the site of the original, of the first steel mill in the United States, Joseph Jenks Steel Mill. He was a British colonist in Lynn, Massachusetts, and he established the Saugus Iron Works there. It's the first one that was done. The second mill, a little bit closer to us now, was the Rittenhouse Mill in Philadelphia. Whereas the first one was a steel mill, Rittenhouse was a textile mill. It was in the Germantown area, now part of Philly, and there they would take not just textiles, it was a paper mill also. So they would take textiles from the nearby area, mush them up into pulp, and create paper from it. This was built in 1644, and it was so popular at the time, such an achievement, that William Penn, the governor of Pennsylvania, commissioned a poem about Pennsylvania, but it's an epic poem, but a large part of that poem actually focuses on this mill. So we see it very much in American history. And we see it in this. Does anybody know what this is? If you're into old money, this is colonial currency. This is the money that was used during the period around the Revolution, a little bit after the Revolution. Now the paper for it has a wonderfully local connection. The paper for it, mostly linen paper, was produced at a paper mill on Big Gunpowder Falls, made out of textiles that were produced around the Baltimore area, taken up there, repulped, and then sent off to Philadelphia to a print shop called Hall & Sellers. Hall & Sellers, if that rings a bell, was Benjamin Franklin's print shop. Hall & Sellers printed much of the money that was used around the time of the American Revolution. So again, we see these connections to scrap and broader parts of American history. And in fact, Paul Revere, after the war, opens a foundry in Boston and then goes around New England and has dealers all up and down the East Coast collecting metal for his foundry. And you can actually see they're looking for bolts, spikes, nails, and malleable copper, cash for old brass and copper. One of my favorite stories is that he goes to Marblehead, Massachusetts, sees a whole bunch of old cannons after the war, and then sends this note, which they recently found in their collection, sends this note asking, hey, all those old cannons, can I have them for my foundry? I think we can use them. And they're just laying around. So again, scrap is embedded in our history. So who's involved in scrap? Collectors, the people who walk around collecting the old stuff. Peddlers, people who maybe they collect it and they'll buy and sell bits of material, so not so much scavenging, but also very small, low-level businesses. Dealers, the people who actually take large amounts of the material, they store it, and they sell it often from the peddlers and the collectors onto the next processors. The processors are the people who take the scrap, they'll sort it, and then they will send it on to the brokers. And the brokers, they are dealing with large amounts of material, huge bales of steel and aluminum rolls of this stuff, and selling it to manufacturers. So whereas the first ones are maybe dealing in pounds, the latter are dealing in tons and hundreds of tons. So this is how the exhibition is sort of, and the way we've conceived it is really to think about it as a scrapyard itself in terms of the functions of a scrapyard. We focus on the raw material that's brought in, clocking in and weighing in, evaluating the material based on its weight, but also the people who were part of the scrapyard, evaluating them and cultivating them, because scrapyards were places especially where immigrants and the lower classes could come and find a foothold and in American life and eventually move up economically into the middle class. Sorting it all out, sorting materials, both the technology of it, but also how the community of scrappers organized itself over time. How things are destroyed in a creative fashion, that there's in fact a great deal of technology and technological innovation that goes into dismantling materials so that they can be reused. But also it all has to be held together so it can be transported. And finally, that today we are very much aware of the need to recycle, and that everything that was once waste can be useful again. So let's talk about the raw material. So this is a wonderful image of the scrap cycle, and it shows very clearly, I can use my laser pointer, that you get scrap and it goes into junk collectors, auto wreckers, and industrial, and it basically gets funneled through this scrap processor, who then sends it on to mills, foundries for new products. Those new products are used up, and it goes back into the cycle. You can make scrap from just about any material. Aluminum, like cans, rags for paper making, textiles, zinc and other non-ferrous metals, which are actually quite valuable, parts of old computers, like rubber, plastic, anything, as I've said, you name it, it can be recycled. And for example, this is probably the most common, in the popular mind, the most commonly recycled thing is an aluminum can. And I think it's on average an aluminum can go from being used to being back on the shelf in something like 28 days. It's incredibly recyclable. It's something that can be, like many metals, can be upcycled, which means that no matter how many times you reuse it, it can be used again. It doesn't degrade over time. Unlike paper, which incidentally is the most valuable form of scrap per weight, even though it's really heavy. The raw material. This is actually an image from the inside of that Hoffman paper mill, based on that. And it shows how the division of labor functioned in early rag recycling. You'd have the rags brought in. Here it was typically a woman. If it was a family business, it was a mother, or maybe some of the girls would sort the rags, rip them up. Then they would go and as they've been shredded, they would be mushed or pulped. Then that pulp would go on screens, be pressed down, dried, and turned into paper. Later on, we have more complex materials. This you'll see in the exhibition is a zinc shoe mold used for injection molding for polyurethane soles. That shoe mold, that zinc, you might think, okay, well, who needs zinc? Well, I think that one mold is probably worth a couple $100. To give you a sense, you multiply that by a left foot and a right foot and all the sizes, and you start to see how there actually is great value in these things. As I said, much can be recycled. Here we actually have computer parts. Often computer recycling, technology recycling is outside the United States. This is an excerpt from a film that appears in the exhibition of scrap computer recyclers in Ghana, that live in a recycling yard in Ghana. And finally, rubber tires, something we wouldn't have necessarily thought of as necessarily scrap, but millions and millions and millions of them are scrapped every year. And if you remember way back, there was an incredible crisis of tire refuse around the country that basically came to be seen as an unused and untapped resource. And now we have a slightly more complex image of the scrap cycle. But again, it's the same type of thing. You've got the producers, they produce household goods, factory equipment, maybe even bridges and tunnels. Those things get used up and they go right back to the manufacturers. And the folks in the yard. This actually are scrap collectors in San Francisco after the Great Fire there, collecting old building materials to be sent on. Which then gets me to the raw material, because when we think about raw material, we're also thinking about the workers, the people who come into the yard to work. So why did scrap suddenly take off at one time or another? So scrap was critical to the Industrial Revolution. In the early mid-19th century, steel making expanded across Europe and the United States, especially through something called the Bessemer process. What's important to know about the Bessemer process is that it could only use a small amount of scrap material, but it was still important, especially for things like railroads. In fact, Carnegie used the Bessemer, had his own mills and used the Bessemer process in those mills to produce the railroads that crisscrossed the country. Later on, it was replaced. I just love these photos. I mean, these drawings, they're just so wonderful. They show these big towering furnaces, shooting out light. It's something out of Jules Verne. Bessemer was eventually replaced by something called the open hearth process, which could use up to about, by the time it was displaced in the 1960s, it could use about 50% of scrap material. So that meant you would need far less raw material, far less digging, shipping in. It made it much more efficient to make steel, which requires a sort of interesting and ever-evolving cocktail of things. Later on, from the 60s, we now get the gas diffusion process. What's important to know here is that this process, which is now really the main common, and there are new processes for steel making, can use almost, if not completely, 100% scrap. So that means that if you're getting steel that was produced in the United States, or really almost anywhere on Earth now, it's probably been something before. So the raw material, who are the raw material? The immigrants, the poor. And this is what 100 years ago you would have seen as a scrapper. It's like that guy in the film. This is a rag, somebody collecting rags on the Lower East Side. A lot of our images are from New York because there was so much scrap generated there. And what are the tools that he needed? A pair of shoes and a bag for carrying everything. Over time, as these guys worked, they spread out all over the country. Wherever there was industry, maybe the railroad and commerce, they followed. You would go from your bag to hopefully a cart, maybe even one carried by a horse. Here is an image of, it's called In Heffern's Junk Shop from a Harper's in the late 19th century. And here we see an Irish family and the division of labor in their junk shop, where they have junk dealing in rags and bottles. The father goes out and collects, maybe teaches the son the value of everything, and the mother and daughter are shredding paper and sorting everything. So you go from a bag to a cart, maybe to a shop. Also, scrap became incredibly important as industries blossomed in the US. So these were two so-called ragmen whose jobs were to go back and forth collecting the scraps and taking them to dealers in New York in the garment district. And so you can imagine the amount of material produced by that industry. And they had to carry these incredibly heavy loads. I mean, it's not like those are empty. Those are, that's probably a ton, if not more, of material there. Okay. And as I said, people moved all over the country, and it was often immigrants, but also you found a large number of African Americans in the trade. Here's an image of an African American scrapper in, I always forget where he's from, somewhere in the Midwest. And here, he's collecting materials from farms. So again, farms were wonderful sources of scrap material, and in fact, you can see the back of a carriage right here that he'll probably come back for a little bit later. Again, more scrappers on the frontier, setting up businesses, getting entrenched in these communities. By the start of the 20th century, a substantial number of these businesses became Jewish-owned, so much so that by the 1960s and 1970s, somewhere between 70 and 90% of scrap businesses were owned and founded by Jewish immigrants. That is an astounding number. It doesn't make any sense, but the scholarship seems to back it up. And that is because you had people who arrived in the United States who had maybe not the language, but they had networks of kin and friends and so on that they could buy and sell and trade with. After the Civil War, as I alluded to a moment ago, you also saw, and there's not enough historical research on this yet. There really needs to be a lot more done. African American scrap recyclers. Here is in fact an image of an African American scrapper considering a sale. Maybe he's going to buy these old metal from this family here. And as I said, by the time we get to the beginning of the 20th century, if you sort of start to see the names of many of the companies here, they're Jewish names, Goldberg and so on. Now, scrap also made its way into popular culture. This is an image from a play, and this is the sign, or the poster, for schmatas, rags. It was an important play that was all about the sort of multi-generational, intergenerational family drama of a family who had come over. The grandfather worked in a rag factory, and nobody else in the family wanted to work in the rag factory, and he felt as if he was being treated as a discarded rag. You also saw, again, rags this is an image from Barrel and Barrel. They were a vaudeville act that traveled all over the country, and they created these rags. You see the sign, rags bought and sold, rented and exchanged, which I love that you can rent the rags. And this painting here is actually created from old rags. So they are drawing on this very much. You know, the fact that so many of the scrap recyclers were and to an extent have been and are immigrants has fueled nativist images of scrap recyclers. You know, from the idea that that to have an honest scrap, that honesty is not part of the field, was conventional thinking. It was seen as dirty, the scrappers untrustworthy. Here's an image from a comic from Puck in 1889 of an Italian who's a scrapper, and he says, "Oh, I've never seen an Italian rag picker give up a ticket with a smile before she's going to take a ferry." And then you see her take the bundle apart, and all of her children are in it. Again, pretty horrific, if you ask me. And there were anti-Jewish stereotypes as well. A dealer in old clothes, you have this person who seems to be maybe a rag dealer in old clothes, but also embodies many Jewish stereotypes, or anti-Jewish stereotypes. And then women too were critical to this business. Often, as I said, the men were out and the dealers. This is an image from the rag market in lower Manhattan at the beginning of the 20th century, almost entirely filled with women. This is an image, this is a cover from Scientific American showing a brand new state-of-the-art factory in papermaking from Massachusetts. And what you see is the men operating the heavy machines, the women maybe folding the paper, preparing it, and working in the rag processing area. So scrap had a very clear division of labor. This is a photograph from a rag sorting room, and in fact, all of the workers here are women who are sorting and shredding, except for this guy who I believe, from what I read, was, 23-year-old overseeing all of these workers, male, who would later go on to work with the heavy machinery. So there were very clear divisions of labor, additional ones. And this is from right down the street from the 1960s. So this endured for a very long time. Clocking in and weighing in. Every scrapyard needs to account for two important inputs: the material that's being sorted and recycled, and the people who do the work. Both are carefully measured and evaluated to obtain the best outcomes. So the first thing that happens when scrap comes into the yard is that it's weighed. This is what it looks like now. A big truck comes in, it goes onto a big scale. But in the past, you maybe didn't have those giant scales, but you had these other workers who would come in and they would look at it, maybe taste it, touch it. We'll get into that in a moment, and start to figure out what the value is. As more and more became recyclable and as technology became more and more complex and able to deal with different types of material, these sorting and weighing operations became more complex, such as this one, which is where this person is overseeing literally hundreds, if not thousands of tons pass in front of him on a daily basis at an aluminum recycling plant. Again, additional images of workers learning how to work in the scrap trade. So these are images that are extolling the virtues of a work training program in the 1970s, where a number of folks who had been laid off or unemployed or maybe came out of prison and needed job training were getting job training, learning how to sort metal, learning how to drive machinery, and so on. As scrap businesses grew in the 20th century, from one-person operations to large, sprawling yards. They needed office workers, they needed staff, they needed a whole administrative apparatus. And frequently, you would find that the people who were working there in the offices would have been women or people with academic training who were able to deal with the accounting, the bookkeeping, and so on. But that's not to say it was always a lovely, pleasant place. Often, up until the 1940s and the enforcement of new zoning laws, frequently, if you had a scrap shop, a junk shop, or a yard in an urban place, it might look like one of these. You know, you've got rags for sale here. The family might have lived upstairs, or they lived in the back, and they had a yard next door. And these were common sights. In fact, here's a yard outside of someone's house in Alabama. Another one in, I think, in Minnesota. And so you can imagine if your neighbor is a scrap recycler, this is what's next to you. I love this painting from the 1930s of a parent pushing a baby carriage past the local junkyard. But you would also see them, you know, this newly built school here is right next to John Doherty and Sons Scrapyard Metals and Iron and Rubber. And you can imagine how tricky it might have been to learn in class while you hear the scrapyard operating next door. But over time, these facilities had to become larger. And this is an image from a yard. This is zeroing in, but it's a yard that's showing the different parts of the yard. This is on the east, on the Hudson River in New Jersey. It was the Shivona-Bonomo yard, and the different ships that can come in. The whole thing is sorted by different types of steel. So these became very complex operations as they grew and moved out of neighborhoods. At the same time as these are growing, you have new technologies. I know I'm throwing a lot at you guys. New technologies that are invented specifically for handling scrap, like this hauler, the specially designed truck, or this double lugger invented by Marvin's father for carrying 2 containers full of scrap. A design for a specially designed scrap platform for loading and unloading railroad. What I'm getting at here is that in addition to the needs for people, as scrap grew, you had the needs for new technology and new solution. And in fact, that created new business lines for a lot of scrap recyclers. They could go and create things like electromagnets, probably the most important technology that has shaped steel recycling ever. It was invented at the the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, shown at a World's Fair, where it sort of amazed people by the ability for a electromagnet suspended from a crane to easily move something that was, you know, several hundred tons. This, in the case of this flywheel, is 20,000 pounds. Before you had an electromagnet that could literally pick this thing up and move it from here to there, that would have taken days and days and days to process. Just to move it. Now you can move it to different parts of the yard. As time went on, that meant you would have enormous yards with thousands and thousands of tons of steel that could then just be picked up and moved right to processors. But these were not just stationary. Here's one on the back of a truck. In addition to the magnets, you have all of this material, that non-ferrous material. Magnets only work on things with iron in them, right? This is one of the most, for me, very frightening type of tool. And in fact, there's a wonderful image in the exhibition of an absolutely enormous claw that can pick up material, move it around the yard, and in this case, drop the turnings into this machine to be baled up, to be sent on. Sorting it all out. So right now, I've sort of talked a little bit about the people and the operations in the yard, but I want to talk a little bit now about sorting. How do you sort? So let me go back to that. So it's not like there's just one type of steel, one type of copper, one type of anything. You've got every single type of metal is really, might have other types of elements in it. And so for somebody who's buying and selling scrap metal, for example, Knowing the chemical composition of that is critical for understanding the value of it, because some of those materials are what gives it its value. So this, for example, is a price guide from Young of Youngstown that as you move it around to figure out the different type of scrap, and in fact you've got the numbers up here to define that tell you what that scrap might be. You then have the composition, the chemical composition here that will give you that will show you the value in gross ton and pound. It's kind of a moving target. But how do you actually sort? Well, historically, by look, by feel, by smell, by taste. Here we have a worker who's actually moving a piece of scrap against a flywheel to see what color the sparks are, and based on the color of the sparks and where they are, they will tell him what the chemical composition of that is. But over time, we've developed other ways to do this. Some are chemical, some are use light, like light spectroscopy, to actually look at, throw light at something and look at the bounce back to figure out what the chemicals might be. But now, very common, what's most common is now we use something called X-ray microfluorescence spectroscopy, which is essentially you shoot an X-ray, or in some cases a laser, at a piece of material that vaporizes a tiny little bit of that, and a machine that's analyzing what happens to that will tell you what the chemical composition of that is. This is one of those machines from the early 1980s. Now, that's what they look like. So it's a handheld thing, and it's got this readout on the back. So basically, I take a piece of material, I put this thing up to it, I squeeze the trigger, and it instantly tells me the chemical composition of that thing. And from that, I can find the value of it. That is incredible to me. To me, that's sort of the magic of this. It's almost unimaginable. It's living in the future. At the same time, we have to sort out all this non-ferrous stuff, things that are coming from computers with gold and copper and so on and so forth. This is the patent for something called an eddy current. And you'll see pictures of these and they're like, oh, it's just a thing that's like throwing, it's a fast-moving conveyor belt that's throwing things. What it does is it uses subtle differences in the magnetic field of different types of materials to sort them. So if something has no magnet, in this case, has no magnetic field or very little, it just gets deposited here. But the stronger that field, the more this machine can throw it and sort it. So for things like copper, or gold, or platinum, these things that are actually very valuable per weight, this type of technology is critical and valuable. A creative destruction, one of the most fun parts. So I mentioned the magnet as being a really critical part of the technology. The other thing that's been really important, this oxyacetylene torch. Who would have thought, right? So the oxyacetylene torch was invented to cut portholes in naval ships in the Brooklyn Navy Yard during the Spanish-American War at the end of the 19th century. A number of scrappers saw this, because there were scrap businesses all around there, and said, hey, we can use that to cut up ships and to cut metal. And so this tool, which is largely unchanged since, is used to cut apart railroad ties, cut apart cars, anything you name it, it's used to cut that apart. The other thing here that we see in terms of creative destruction is the shear. This shear is they're all hydraulic shears, but this one was just basically a scissors, almost like Pac-Man. It just goes chomp, chomp, chomp. And the workers there would feed material into it. It would get cut apart, and those bits they could take and then process them. Now they are much safer, but there the likelihood of losing a finger or an arm or your life was much higher. We have other things like crushers. In this case, you actually can see the car in this crusher. The operator's back here. That crushes it, funnels it down, and then smushes it into a cube like that, a bale. We often think of cars getting shredded, like going into a machine and getting turned into little tiny bits. That's a relatively recent invention. The first kind of attempt to deal with automobiles, which really has been one of the most important and most difficult things to scrap up until the last couple decades, has been to, you take the car, this is an innovation from 1929, You take the car, you burn everything that's not metal out of it. Not great. Smush it and then throw it into the hearth. Not really viable, but this was from a Scientific American that claimed that this would revolutionize the problem of car waste. But what really did it was this thing, the shredder mill, the mega shredder as they're often called. What we see on the left here is an image of the so-called prolarizer, invented, really conceived of on an airplane flight in the 1950s by Mr. Proler, who was a Texan recycler, and he thought, okay, I've got a lot of cars. Normally it takes a day or 2 days or 3 days to take apart a car. I want to come up with something that can do that in a matter of minutes or even seconds. And so what he invented, and a number of others were inventing it at the same time, was apparently was the shredder mill. Let me go back to that. In the shredder mill, an automobile is fed into this hopper, and then these things spin around and they pulverize the car. And then from there, it's sorted through a variety of different technologies and then pumped out into these recyclable piles of material. And what it looks like when it's going, this is essentially you just have stuff going in, being pumped in. Now, this is a video from a relatively new technology called Lumistar. And what it uses a variety of different optical technologies to see the material going into the shredder and being ground up. And why would you need that? Well, grinding up material like this, an engine block, an entire car, produces a tremendous amount of heat. And the only way you can keep these machines working is by continually spraying water on them, which means you get a ton of steam, and you can't see what's going on. This is one of my favorite parts, although I think I ended up cutting it off. But this truck, it's going into the shredder here, so that's just being ground and crushed, and it's going to go in. And for whatever reason, it explodes. I think they didn't empty the gas tank or something like that. And then boom. But what happens? The shredder just keeps on going. So you have to imagine the level of not just the technology, but also the metallurgy, the incredible thinking that goes into something like this. Creative destruction, another source for all of this material, in fact, the most important, I think, historically has been war. And in fact, here's an old train car that's been destroyed. It's in Richmond in the aftermath of the Civil War. Now, war was incredibly important, and I will talk about these two guys as a case in point, Nathan Klein and Louis Bernheim. Klein and Bernheim were German Jewish immigrants that came to the United States in, I think, 1863. They were immediately drafted and sent to Tennessee to fight on the Union side. Unfortunately, they didn't speak any English, and they could not figure out what was going on, and they were very quickly discharged and just sent on their way. Without anything to do, aside from knowing each other and maybe a couple of other people, they started collecting battlefield material, sending it on, trading it probably with both sides, and within a couple of years, they'd established their own business, Klein and Bernheim, selling feathers, beeswax, ginseng, but also trading in materials in Cincinnati, setting themselves up very well for a regional business. I will add that Klein and Bernheim became important philanthropists in the Cincinnati Jewish community, which hints at really the important role of scrappers in many of the communities around the country, especially in Jewish communities, where they helped to establish philanthropies, Jewish communal organizations, and so on. This also is my other example, the USS Indiana. So the Indiana was the flagship of the Great White Fleet around the time, right before the Spanish-American War, really at the very beginning of American imperialism. This is a painting of it in the Battle of Havana. You can see it right in the center. It was eventually decommissioned after the First World War as the U.S. was demilitarizing substantially and sent to be used, in this case, in Chesapeake Bay for target practice. So there it is, right after it was basically hit for the last time. Then it was hauled to Baltimore and scrapped. And I have not been able to figure out what became of the metal. I think it went into becoming maybe the Empire State Building, but definitely a bridge or something else. The important thing to remember here is that all of this gets reused and reused, and so a lot of the icons that we have in American society, in fact, come from scrap. Additional images of types of scrap: battlefield scrap, tanks, helmets from the end of the Second World War, iron and steel scrap production. We have this image in the exhibition. The important thing to notice is that during times of war, scrap production goes up. It's incredibly critical to the war effort. But also, you have an entire culture built around conservation. Posters. And in fact, during the Second World War, it's well known that the Roosevelt administration worked with Madison Avenue advertisers to create whole advertising campaigns to cultivate scrap recycling around the country. They came up with scrap in the United States, Jack Scrap in Great Britain, to give a mascot to it. The idea that it is junk that is going to win the Second World War was an important message. As a result, you had scrap drives around the country, children in Minneapolis collecting aluminum, Walt Disney donating the bronze Bambi, or Bambi's mom, I think, from his lawn. My favorite, I love this, Scrappo the Scrap Robot, which was used for a big performance in Salem, Oregon. In fact, there was a puppeteer that operated the mouth, somebody else who was telling stories with it. Supposedly, this was on newsreels, but I have not been able to find it. But it's just fantastic. You know, first of all, he says, don't pile scrap here. He moves around and talks, and he has a bucket for fats and grease, all critical to the war effort. This image is, in fact, the removal of the golden spike, the ceremonial removal of the golden spike at Promontory Point, as the original tracks for the Transcontinental Railroad were picked up and scrapped to be used in the Second World War effort. You have games, in enormous piles of tires, rubber being used in the war effort. Rubber, in fact, was probably the most important material because all of the rubber plantations had been taken over by the Japanese. So in fact, the reason why you had gas ration cards in the Second World War wasn't to save gas so much as it was to save tires. So scrap was seen as a national resource, a resource that was critical to national security. So over time, you had government agencies, in fact, enforcing price ceilings, defining the value of scrap, shaping the way that scrap was collected and paid for, and producing maps of where you could take your scrap to donate it. Businesses were mobilized to buy and sell scrap, and they were rewarded with commendations. They had messages to all of their to their customers saying that if you're coming to our business, bring your stuff, we'll take it. It's critical to the war effort. But also, scrap was seen as critical to the peace effort. In 1944, a plan was put forward, beating swords into plowshares in the modern version, for how we will take all of the battlefield detritus and create something new. And in fact, the scrap industry, these individuals were all different leaders of the largest scrap companies in the United States on a visit to Europe to investigate the former battlefields and see what could be used subsequently, ultimately as part of the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe. Holding it together. It's not important that you remember what these are, but what's important to know is that the scrap industry, like every industry, has created a variety of different trade organizations for itself. But those trade organizations, which have merged and unmerged and changed over time, have not just been a way to legitimize themselves in the face of other industries. It's been a way to create community, and it's been a way to represent themselves and the image of scrap more broadly. They created standards starting in 1914, standards for classifications of different types of scrap, because as I said, there were questions about the level of honesty I should say, of scrappers. And in dealing with this PR problem, scrap organizations tried to standardize based on the types of scrap that were out there, values for different types of things, how to actually handle materials. And over time, they created more and more publications that would help push their message and their value. The idea that with scrap you could have, it's a different image now, but in 1930, this image of a beautiful industrial future complete with smokestacks and an airplane flying over. But they saw themselves very much as literally, as Benjamin Schwartz, the first president of the Institute of Scrap Iron and Steel, said, the conservers of national wealth. Now, the other thing to realize is that, as I said, many scrappers were Jewish, and in this case, the scrap age, the voice of the dealer, this was a gin rummy card put out by that magazine with the Heddlemans, a Baltimore family of scrap rag recyclers. So on the interior of this is the gin rummy scorecard, and on the back is a calendar for 3 years of Jewish holidays. So that really illustrates the presence of Jews in the scrapping community. I'm gonna speak over this because there's no audio. There's no talking. This is one of the most famous images of scrap technology that you will see. In it, it's from James Bond, from Goldfinger, and in it, this character has just murdered a CIA agent. The agent's in the car, takes the car, puts it into something called a baler, which basically just crushes the car into a shape, into a cube. It'll get crushed, picked up with an electromagnet, dropped in another car, and taken on. So what this scene is doing two things. It's showing the technology, and in fact, that is a mobile car crusher, something that was relatively new at the time, so you could just be strapped onto the back of a truck and moved all around the yard. But it also hints at the idea that there is something pernicious about scrap recycling, something criminal, something mafia-like. You can't say that there were no criminals in any industry, scrap being one of them, but of course you cannot say an entire industry is one. But this plays on that image. Useful again. It's not easy to recycle material. And in fact, one of the hardest things, as I said, was cars and means of transportation. This is an image of old streetcars being so-called scrapped. And the way to get the material at the time was literally to set everything on fire, burn off as much as you possibly could, and recycle the rest, which was really the metal. This is incredibly wasteful, incredibly toxic. It poisons air for people around the yard, but also groundwater with all of the runoff. There were attempts to sort of find ways around the pollution. In fact, this is a car incinerator concept to grab the stuff that was thrown out, but it wasn't possible. It wasn't viable. Also, as technology has evolved more broadly, you have more and more toxic materials, such as radioactive materials, and this is a screening apparatus for trucks that go into a yard to see if there is radioactive material in them. So by the 20th century, by the mid-late 20th century, we have an overabundance of things like cars, old streetcars, so much stuff that in fact it feels like it's literally garbage and recycling, potentially recycled materials on the trees. I don't know where this image is from. I found it in the archives of the Institute of Scrap Recycling Industries. I love it. I wish I knew what it was from, but it makes me chuckle every time. But starting in the mid-1960s and really up until the present, you have a growing number of environmental policies and ultimately agencies to oversee the Americans' environmental health. So this is about water and air, but more than that. And what that led to ultimately was a series of regulations in quick succession that were meant to improve environmental quality, but it came at the expense for the scrap recycling community at best lack of clarity into what they needed to do, and at worst the criminalization of many of their practices. So if you had a yard and you had motor oil running into a nearby stream, that suddenly became illegal. You suddenly became a polluter. And if you sold your business or went bankrupt, you were still liable. This was incredibly problematic for scrap recyclers, and as a result, many of their businesses failed. And this is what those yards looked like. And in many cases, it was almost overnight that this happened. And you had to have the capital to reinvest and improve your business. Otherwise, you would be subject to things like Superfund litigation and so on. This is a scrapyard in Rhode Island. This is an image that was taken in 1974 during a survey by the Environmental Protection Agency for potentially hazardous sites around the country. Things started to really change for good and for ill with the signing of the Highway Beautification Act. This was an act that was supposed to hide the scrap yards, which are all over the United States, lining the highways and main roads with green screens and so on. It was meant to beautify the landscape, but it also, again, it perpetuated the idea that there was something wrong with these businesses, something toxic and poisoning. And so in this image, I think, from a publication from the scrap industry, I think is really an expression of that tension of how do you balance law with the need to retain this business. Over time, the industry was able to, through a variety of different lobbying activities, but also through a really strong PR effort, to try to fix its image. And in fact, the idea in this case from a publication, the Phoenix Quarterly, that scrap recycling could employ new technologies, and this was part of a generational shift as well, new technologies to tame the beast of pollution, and in fact could take scrap into new places, including into space. Again, we're back into Jules Verne territory. And then moving ahead with ideas of things like design for recycling, that you could that industries should be pushed more and more and more to think of the products that they're designing not just as things that have an end life after they sell them, but as things that have to be, that can go on and be reused and reused and reused. That's why now it's very easy to recycle your washing machine, or obviously your car, your television, and so on. But that's not to say it's universal all over the world. In fact, scrap is still processed around the world very much by hand in many places, although that is changing. These are car recyclers not too long ago in Jamaica. Still doing it very much by hand. I showed you this image before of technology recyclers in a yard in Ghana, literally picking apart microchips and boards by hand. Things have changed since this photo was taken, but this is an image from Chittagong, which is one of the largest in Sri Lanka. It's one of the largest ship scrapping yards in the country. When I think of ship scrapping, I think of people in hard hats and vests and safety equipment taking things apart with large machinery. No, here they are. They don't even necessarily have shoes on. They're doing this with hand tools. So it's uneven. But things have changed, and things are changing. In China, for example, where the United States was sending the bulk of its scrap metal for well over a decade, scrap imports had been very, very high, up and down, but they had been very, very high for a long time. But now, not because of tariffs, but much more because of labor costs and technology changes and larger economic forces, we now see in 2019 the scrap iron trade between the United States and China is 0. And finally, and now this is where I wrap up, useful again, scrap can have incredible symbolic meaning. Here we have the bow section for the USS New York, a ship that was built and commissioned in the mid-2000s. The bow section of this ship and a sister ship is made out of about 100 tons of material taken from the World Trade Center that was destroyed on September 11, 2001. Here we see it as it was commissioned on its maiden voyage past the Statue of Liberty. The Statue of Liberty, too, and this is my final little story, is itself a product of scrap. When it was refurbished in 1985, there was one of the big challenges for the company that was doing that was to find copper that had the exact same patina as panels that were being replaced. Well, they were looking and looking and looking, and one of the contractors happened to know that the roof of the Bell Labs in New Jersey was being replaced. That roof was put on roughly the same time, also made out of copper, and so Bell Labs donated their roof to be recycled as part of the refurbishing of the Statue of Liberty. Thank you very much. I'm more than happy to take questions after we hurry up. Take questions, yeah.
In your opinion, what's the future of the scrap industry across the country today?
So, I'll put this on because I think we're recording. So the question is, what do I think the future of the scrap industry is? You know, as an industry, I'm not sure, but I think that the potential for it is incredible because at the end of the day, this is about taking things that are commodities that people don't realize are commodities, that are valuable and can be reused, and making them reusable. And so if we are moving as a society into a place where we realize that we no longer can live with the idea of unlimited resources, then we will hopefully start to move toward the idea that we need to find ways to reuse the resources that we already have. So I think the short answer is I imagine that it's probably quite bright, but that comes with a tremendous heavy lift. And at the end of the day, and this is my personal hope, that our government leaders will see fit to fund research into technologies that make recycling and scrap recycling more feasible nationally. Because it's wonderful to celebrate an industry, but it will have more and more of an impact with, and again, this is my opinion, with a national coordinated effort, which is not necessarily the case at the moment. Yes?
What was the urge people to collect oil, I think, in Greece?
Mm-hmm.
What did they use that for?
So what would they use oil and grease for in the Second World War? Bombs. You could use it, yeah, you could use it for combustibles, but also for lubricants. It's one of those things that you could use in a variety of different ways. There's a poster, I think it's in the exhibition, and it's an image, it says "Save your cooking fats," and it's somebody, it's a hand that's tilting an iron pan into an opened up bomb. So these were used for combustibles, yeah. Anything else?
You mentioned
Yeah.
the name Bernheim.
Yes.
So what century was that?
Klein and Bernheim. So they immigrated to the United States, I believe it was in 1863. Yeah.
The reason I ask is because there was a fellow named I.W. Bernheim
Mm-hmm.
who was big in whiskey in Kentucky.
So I could not figure it out if they were the same. It wouldn't surprise me if they were, but I couldn't find definitively if it was the case. No, I went down a rabbit hole with that one.
About 4 years ago, we had a fellow from Brooklyn, New
Yeah.
York, who came down and he wrote a book called The Bourbon Empire.
Yeah.
And apparently back then, like 30% of the all bourbon and whiskey in Kentucky and Tennessee was owned by Jews. And I.W. Bernheim, he was afraid of that he would never sell his whiskey, so he called it I.W. Harper.
Oh.
So if you know the name I.W. Harper,
Huh.
and I think we even have it downstairs, this big thing of I.W. Harper, which Cal and I had, and course, throughout, big glass ceramic there. But IW Hopper apparently is now sold in Japan.
Wow. I found that reference, but I couldn't figure out definitively if it was the case, so I didn't include it in the exhibition. Anything else? Well, thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the exhibit.